The rest at St Honorin did not last long. The German army was in full retreat, and they had to be pursued. The Sherwood Rangers followed the 11th Armoured Division as they passed through the Falaise Pocket. The scenes in the Falaise Pocket, where Allied air power had wreaked such destruction, were horrendous. The various German divisions had taken a terrible pounding in the Normandy battle. Panzer Lehr, for instance, had lost all its tanks and infantry units, while about 50,000 of the enemy had been killed and some 200,000 taken prisoner. Thousands still lay unburied within the pocket. The roads and fields were littered with German dead, in various stages of decomposition. Then there were the carcasses of cows and horses, the smashed vehicles and abandoned carts laden with loot. Many of the human and animal bodies had swelled grotesquely in the summer sun, and the stench was awful. "Who in God's name will do what about this lot?" asked Padre Skinner. It was a fair question. They stopped for 3 days at L'Isle, in a much more pleasant-smelling pear orchard, where B Echelon were able to catch up and resupply them. But on August 27th they were back on the move, heading towards the River Seine. They moved 60 miles through Rougle, Conchet and Évreux, without issues. At Ur, my tank broke down. I spent a very pleasant evening with Dick Holman in the local hotel, where we had to fend off the gathering crowds of jubilant French inhabitants, eager to buy us drinks and shower us with gifts. Then the next morning I had to leave my tank and crew, in order to rejoin the squadron at Vernon. The bridge at Vernon had been blown. Infantry of 43 Division were ferried over to create a bridgehead. And under considerable fire, a Bailey Bridge was constructed. Hills and the rest of the squadron crossed the Seine, and then continued to push forward another 30 miles. Montgomery was urging all speed to drive the enemy from northern France, and the tanks of 8th Armoured Brigade found themselves in the vanguard of the advance, in the general direction of Amiens. The country between the Seine and the Somme is open and rolling, with wide fields, no hedges, and good roads. Apart from a few woods, the only trees are those surrounding villages. How different we found it from the closeness of the bocage, which had hindered us as much as it had helped the German defenders. Now all the advantage lay with the speedy Shermans, which could bypass potential sources of trouble and rely on their mechanical efficiency to make ground very quickly. The Germans had of course covered the same stretch of country at comparable speeds in 1940. It was good tank country, and now the success of their blitzkrieg tactics was easier to understand. To travel at top speed across hard open country on a lovely morning, knowing that the Germans were on the run, was exhilarating to say the least, and everyone was in the best possible spirits. It was almost like taking part in a cross-country steeplechase, or going on a pre-war motoring tour. In every village we passed we received terrific welcomes. Occasionally we would stop to receive the fruits of our successes, in the form of something to eat or drink, but usually we passed through in a cloud of dust, hardly able to see or hear the cheering groups of liberated French. No doubt we left them a little bewildered, wondering what on earth was happening after 4 long years of occupation and hardship, but we could only reflect that their lives were about to change for the better, and that they would soon catch up with events. In the last 3 days of August they travelled over 100 miles. There was a short action near St Remy before they headed for the Somme. Also on 29th of August, John Law died of his wounds, which he had taken at Bergieux. At Juvigny they paused on August 30th for supplies to catch up. The pace of the pursuit posed real supply problems. In one place 5 tanks of A Squadron became bogged down trying to cross a river, and had to wait to be towed out. Then some of the tanks ran out of petrol and had to be left behind until the fuel truck caught up with them. Occasionally we needed to be resupplied with ammunition, as we had to deal with pockets of the determined German rear guard. For the most part the German columns were streamed back eastwards as fast as they could go, spurred on by the knowledge that they needed to escape the wrath of the local population even more than they did us. Amiens was captured on the 31st by 29th Armoured Brigade, and the Sherwood Rangers headed through Longpre, Les Amiens towards Doullens. In the village of Flesselles they encountered the first real resistance since Normandy. A German Panzer IV tank, concealed in the railway station, scored a direct hit on Sergeant Cribben MM's tank, killing him and Trooper Sharp. Padre Skinner heard the news when on the road, and at first was refused permission to investigate because of the continuing danger. At length he secured the services of a truck and driver, and finally made his way into Flesselles on foot, via a ditch and a farmyard. He could see Cribben's destroyed tank sitting near the churchyard, and heard that the wounded had already been taken away by our men. The bodies of Cribben and Sharp had been washed, and the graves had already been dug in the churchyard, under the noses of the Germans, who were still there. Skinner recorded the two men's names, ranks and numbers, saw to the correct marking of the crosses, and gave them to the village priest to place in position when the Germans had gone. Although no coffins were ready, a farmer produced some hessian, and Skinner stitched the bodies up, and he watched from the window as the priest led the funeral down the street to the churchyard, and conducted the service while the Germans watched 30 yards away from their tank without interference. Such were the courtesies of war. There was another action at Nieurs, and then Doullens, where 3 German anti-tank guns and 3 tanks were destroyed, as well as about 200 prisoners taken, with one loss, however, Trooper Flatty of B Squadron. The area had also been used as a V1 launch site, which they inspected before moving on to Sus St Leger. Altogether on September 1st we crossed the Somme, travelled 50 miles and captured a large town, as well as taking many prisoners, so it all amounted to a good day's work. It was a period of jostling and scrambling around in small units, which were separated from one another by breakdowns, shortage of fuel, and the tactical diversions necessary, both to protect our flanks and to eliminate small but dangerous enemy pockets. We spent much time searching fields and farmhouses for signs of the enemy, although this usually proved to be a fruitless task. We could not exactly relax, but we were able to take stock more fully of the events of the past few breathless days, and perhaps to begin to believe that we were now truly winning. After a day's rest, they pushed through Lille. On September 4th, they crossed into Belgium through Tournai and were given a very enthusiastic welcome. A Squadron then went to Oudenarde, B Squadron to Kirchhoff, and Hills with C Squadron to Reims. Reims was a delightful town, virtually unscathed by the war, and we were the first troops to arrive there. From the windows of virtually every house flew a Belgian flag, and there were even some scattered Union Jacks and Stars and Stripes. Certain houses apparently belonged to collaborators and had been burnt to the ground, and we saw some young women whose heads had been shaved because they had fraternised with the enemy. My troop had to guard a bridge. This only required one tank, so we could take it in turns, and in the meantime enjoy the liberation festivities. We drank, sang, danced in the inn nearby, and we all went mad. On the next day, C Squadron pushed even further north, to the vicinity of Ghent, where we engaged an enemy column with some success, where elements of B Squadron under Bill Wharton patrolled just south of Reims. B Squadron ended up being called to the village of Pierre, southeast of Reims, which was held by around 1,200 German soldiers. Bill Wharton entered under a white flag, but the German colonel refused to negotiate with anyone who was of lower rank. So Stanley Christopherson entered in a French car along with Stephen Mitchell, Wharton, and the priest of the neighbouring village, perched on the bonnet, waving a white sheet in one hand and holding his hat with the other. A negotiation was eventually agreed that the German garrison would surrender and march out at 7 o'clock that evening. By 7:30 there was no sign of them, until a burst of machine gun fire was heard from the other side of the village. The Germans had misunderstood the rendezvous and exited on the wrong side of the village and ran into some oblivious Green Howards who opened fire. Fortunately, only one German was killed before members of the Sherwood Rangers broke up the engagement. On September 7th we left Rons, and the whole town came out to say goodbye. They seemed sorry to see us go, and the feeling was mutual. We followed the Guards Armour Division through Vaud and into Brussels, which had only just been liberated. Our progress through the city recalled scenes of triumphant Romans parading through their own capital. We sat on top of our tanks and tried to catch the copious quantities of food, flowers and wine thrown at us by the delirious crowds. We waved until our arms were sore, returned their cheers, and grabbed at any girl who came close enough. Never have I seen such a spontaneous outburst of sheer joy, and our own smiles were as broad as the ocean. After passing through Brussels, they moved on towards Louvain, spending the night at Herschot, having covered around 60 miles that day. 2 days were spent on rest and maintenance. Many of the tanks had covered about 2,000 miles since D-Day and were in desperate need of work. They were also given the opportunity of a night back in Brussels. Beyond Brussels, however, German resistance was stiffening. We were about to get into some of the most bitter fighting the regiment endured during the whole war. For C Squadron it was certainly worse than Berjou. My own crew was also about to change. Since Arthur Reddish had retired to England with his damaged finger after Normandy, I was left with a smaller crew of 4 for the chase through France. Bill Cousins, the gunner, Jeff Story, driver, and Sam Kerman, wireless operator. Now Jeff and Sam, both of whom had been with me through training, to D-Day and beyond, were to go. Jeff was moved on to another less experienced crew, while Sam, so recently promoted to sergeant, went to Regimental HQ to operate for the Regimental Second-in-Command. In their place came Bob Ingle as my driver, and Corporal Jim Darrington as wireless operator. Together with Bill Cousins they made a formidable bunch, although we were still short of manpower, and so didn't have a co-driver/lap gunner, something of a disadvantage in close fighting. Our progress through Brussels and the festive spirit of our day in the area had made us a little blasé about the continuing threat posed by the war. I certainly felt that I had now become something of a veteran, and I could deal with any situation that presented itself. For a mere 20-year-old, these were dangerous thoughts, and I ought to have known enough about the German army from my time in Normandy to realise that wounded and cornered tigers have to be treated with the greatest caution and respect. This lesson I was soon to learn at Geel.